Well, welcome back to the Azure podcast. This is episode number 403, recorded on the 17th of November, 2021. And on Teams with me today, I actually have our special guest in person, which is awesome, Gopi, and as well as Sujit. And as always, before we get into the topic to talk about GitHub and Azure today, we have some updates to share. Sujit, do you want to start first?
Well, thank you, Cynthia. Nice to see you back in the office there with your colleagues. So I have 3 updates to share today. And we had a whole round of them with Ignite and whatnot in the last few weeks, but we actually have some this week as well. The product team doesn't sleep, I guess. They just keep on going. So the 3 that I have to share are, first one is the ability to run commands and scripts on your virtual machine as well as your entire virtual machine set. So just imagine that something's wrong with the virtual machine. You want to run a quick command, and maybe you can't access it right now, but through the portal you can provide a script or a PowerShell script or a Bash script and have it run on all the machines in your virtual machine set, or just one that you want to target. And then the output can be, you can view it or you can redirect it to a storage account. So this is really handy for troubleshooting, as well as doing one-off jobs. Maybe you have a line of business application running on your VMs and you have to do like some cleanup job or something like that. You can just quickly run it through that facility. So this is, I think, a nice feature. Second one is with Azure Functions. As you know, Azure Functions has this concept of bindings, which very easily let you read and write data that you're going to process inside of your function. And in the past, we've had bindings for Cosmos DB, for Event Hub, for Event Grid, storage, etc., but never had it for Azure SQL. So now we have a binding for Azure SQL. So very easily, you can read some data in your function from Azure SQL, do some processing, and then write it back into Azure SQL just by using the concept of bindings, which is kind of like a no-code, low-code approach to reading and writing from storage. And the third I want to talk about, Cynthia, is the NFS file system in Azure Files. This one is close to me because I remember this was a big pain point back when we were trying to do the IBM WebSphere on AKS clusters. So any of these enterprise applications that require a file clustering or a quorum-based file system, you can't use the Samba file system, which typically Azure Files exposes. You need NFS, the network file system. And so the NFS file shares now support NFS version 4.1, and that would open up a whole lot of other possibilities for applications that can run and use Azure Files as that central storage. Otherwise, you have to spin up your own NFS server, which is not a trivial task, and it requires failover and whatnot. Here, you get all of that for free because we all know Azure storage is very resilient, and so this will be a very handy thing for our customers. Cynthia, what about you?
Awesome. I had one around API management. It's a round of updates for October. I can't remember if we covered this in terms of our Ignite updates already, but we have now native support for WebSocket APIs that has gone GA, as well as Event Grid integration that has also gone GA, and some of the new things. If we have not talked about container apps enough, we need to talk about it again. And now you're able to import container apps as an API and API management, similar to the experience that you would do with app services and functions. And API also now supports managed identity authentication to communicate with app insights. And you are also able to have multi-dimensional request metric in Azure Monitor. So we'll definitely put the link if you're interested in any of those details. And now moving on to our special guest, Gopi. Gopi, can you introduce yourself to our listeners and tell us what you do at Microsoft?
I'm first, excited to be here. I know I was part of, many channel line videos. I have done many DevOps sessions with the Donovan too. So great to be, part of the Azure podcast as well. I'm Gopinath. I was part of Microsoft for 21, 22 years now. I worked on various developer products, developer at heart, and, worked on starting with Silverlight to Windows Phone to Visual Studio to .NET compilers to debuggers to very recently, I was actually part of Azure DevOps and then GitHub. I was a group product manager, driving Azure pipelines. In fact, I'm the one who created most of the Azure pipelines related, features. And currently, I just recently moved to the customer success team to help Azure application innovation to be super successful. Glad to be here.
Awesome. So I guess the first question we need to ask you is, as a developer where a lot of people live and breathe in GitHub, how does that relate to Azure? Like, what is the connection there and how do we use it together?
Awesome. Okay. Like if you see many people, if you're not sure about it, I think let me just share one statistic. Every application that is running today on the web or anywhere contains some part of the open source. And that open source is actually coming from GitHub. So even today itself, even if you don't do anything, so there is already every application that is running on Azure has some unknown connection back to GitHub. Right? Because every open source package, like 97% of the packages are actually just using the open source and they're running on any cloud too. Now, in addition to this, what we are trying to do purely from Microsoft perspective is, if you are a developer who is working on GitHub, how can we help make it easy for you to deploy those applications to Azure? Now we are using GitHub Actions as a big platform to connect these two. So you can write your applications. You can continue to use, GitHub, your favorite, code editing tool to build. But for deploying, use GitHub Actions, and then we make it easy to deploy to Azure.
Now, Gopi, I know. I mean, I've obviously written some GitHub Actions tasks and whatnot that deploy to app services. So what's the next step in this evolution over here? Like, what else are you hoping to achieve with this new initiative?
Yeah. So, I think today, if you just go back and then see, you pick any popular Azure resource, it can be app service, Kubernetes, or functions, logic apps, and maybe even the recent announced container apps too. I'm sure, there is a GitHub action, that is available for customers to pick and then deploy it. So we have built a great story there. Now, as a next step, I think, there are a few scenarios that we're all looking at it. Like it's all about how do we optimize the developer life cycle, right? The developer life cycle with respect to starting an environment, like a developer environment, writing my code in code spaces, using GitHub Actions to deploy to Azure, to how do I just get some of the monitoring data and then look at all of these together in a single place, right? Sorry, the other place I just missed is the dev test too. And then there are investments that are just getting done to make sure that we have a great story end to end for a developer to get started from ideation to application running in the production and then monitoring it. That's the scenario that we are looking at it.
So you mentioned, I think, two-part. You said environments and kind of infrastructure setup, and then you also talk about what is the actual application code running on it. When you think about developers, do you see people specializing in infrastructure and people specializing in code? And how does it differ in their experience with GitHub and Azure?
I see. Okay, so that's a tough question, right? There are multiple ways that everyone is thinking about. But based on my conversations with customers and how the industry is evolving, slowly, like if I just see the gap or even the line between developer and then the IT or ops is slowly reducing. If you see many of the startups, and even in fact, I will just tell you, even in Azure DevOps too, like we have evolved having three separate teams, dev team, IT team, ops teams as a separate teams to a single team, right? We do see, it's an evolution, like it depends on the maturity model of the teams. But there are scenarios where mostly developers are in charge. They are writing the code, they are writing the IT infrastructure, they're even managing the ops too, right? If there is a request that just comes in, or if there is an alert, or if there is an incident that happens, developers also take the call. Like that's one class of customers that exist. But there are a set of customers who have significant IT infrastructure policy requirements, and then these are all real because of either the compliance reasons or for the governance reasons. In that cases, there are separate IT teams who actually really know what does it mean for me to make sure that my entire infrastructure is compliant, right? It meets either my certification requirements or my governance requirements or my specific region requirements, and they try to control some of those, and then they are the ones who are in charge of, in that case, writing either their ARM templates or infrastructure as code. But they work very closely with dev or the development team. In fact, that's where the GitHub comes into the picture, or that's where infrastructure as code comes into the picture. How do we just bring these two a lot more closer together? And the industry is moving towards it.
Yeah, Gopi, I can see one gap when I was trying to, using GitHub Actions to deploy my applications. Deploying apps is one thing, but creating the infrastructure before that was something you typically did by hand, or you have to then create this Terraform script or ARM template or bicep exactly. But as a developer, it's hard to imagine what that should be. You're writing code and okay, this is code is, it's great. Are we looking at helping them actually, figuring out what that infrastructure should look like, right? And then deploying it for them. I think the apps deployment is there, but the infrastructure deployment still looks a little bit like a little bit of a hurdle for developers to circumvent.
That's right. Yeah, I think there is a maturity that is needed there. But as Cynthia was pointing out, Biceps makes a little bit easier because the abstraction level is a lot more higher. It's not about ARM template where you may need to create a JSON file and then tweak the JSON file, which is like a huge one. But yes, I think so one is that's a solution. Like Bicep is the one that's just going to help us make it better. The other pattern I'm just seeing here, where people are trying to leverage, like inside the GitHub there are ARM templates that are available already. Like there are tons of quick start templates that are available, and when the bootstrap, what does it mean for me to just use it as is, right? Let me just pick the ARM template as is and then tweak like whatever key parameters that are needed. That's one pattern that people are following. The next pattern that I have actually just seen is, like, in fact, the ID team creates these ARM templates and then they completely secure those ARM because it's to do with the infrastructure and the production resources. But you know what? They give permissions for you to use those. If you want to exactly take the same ARM templates and deploy to your dev environment or a QA environment or a integration environment too, you can just consume them as is. That's another big pattern that I'm just seeing. In fact, that's what is called shift left in a way. That shift left because your production environment, your dev environment looks almost similar. The only place where they will tweak it is if they are using a high-priced scalable SKU on the production, they use a low-end SKU in their dev and test environment so that they can just do the testing. So that's another pattern that customers are following.
This is probably a rather specific question, but since you work on the Azure pipelines, I'm curious, is there a similar idea of environment variables within GitHub Actions? I remember in Azure DevOps where you can kind of point out these and then it can swap for your dev credentials, your prod credentials. Is there a similar thing you can do in GitHub as well?
That's right. Actually, GitHub also has something called secrets.
Okay.
And the environment variables too. You can set those, at the repo level. Like I think, the concept of, repo is the primary, critical thing there in the GitHub, but they do now have an environment concept too. So you can set your variables at a repo level or even at environment level, and then you can repurpose them. And then if they are secrets, like, they completely protect it. And then every time you just to clone a repo or you try to just to reuse it, you can control with the ACLs, with the permissions on who can do it, who cannot do it too. So yes, definitely.
Got it. Okay.
So if people don't know on this podcast, like the GitHub Actions, the backend is actually Azure pipelines.
Good to know. Is that why they're still using YAML?
Yes. The YAML and GitHub Actions is, we learned all the mistakes that we have done in Azure pipelines and then, made it much better. Like the GitHub Actions YAML looks, clean, neat.
Gopi, you mentioned monitoring earlier, right, in your initial discussion. And that's another pain point, I think, right, for developers, just to complete the whole story. Okay, now you've deployed your infrastructure, you deployed your apps, and monitoring from GitHub is, I mean, GitHub has no like monitoring dashboard, as we all know, at least not that I'm aware of. Maybe there is something coming up, but what's the monitoring story? Like, how should developers think about monitoring, as more as it relates to using GitHub as an like code spaces and things like that?
Yeah, good question. I will tell you, yes, I don't think GitHub today has any monitoring story, but the way to think about is like it's just purely my perspective or my viewpoint. Monitoring is always tied a lot more to the cloud that you are targeting. Because the way Azure monitoring works versus the way AWS monitoring works or the GCP monitoring works is significantly different. Or it is fine. Like some customers can decide to say, hey, what, I'm a Kubernetes, I will just continue to use Prometheus as my monitoring. So all of these are different concepts and then the different models that exist. Today, the way GitHub just looks at it, once your application is deployed, can I actually just give you pointers on the environment so that you can actually just go reach out to your specific cloud target? Now, whichever is the cloud target, you should be able to configure appropriate monitoring things. Or if it is completely neutral like Prometheus too, you can just use those. But that's the point of view.
Gopi, coming from your perspective of being very in touch with GitHub as our developer cloud and then Azure as our like underlying compute infrastructure cloud, do you see people from the developer cloud going into Azure, or do you see people from the Azure cloud going into GitHub?
Okay, I don't know how to answer this question, but the developers would love to stick around as much as possible in the GitHub, but they do need to do some activities. As Suji was asking, what do I need to do for monitoring? You do need to go there. So there is a good bridge that just needs to be built between people on the GitHub to go back to Azure, right? But now the question you're asking is, people on the Azure, do they need to go back to GitHub? Like the way I just think about this is, today there are ways of when I'm creating now new resources, or when I'm just building up something brand new with respect to my application patterns too. Like it'll be great for us to just to make sure, can I actually automatically provision GitHub with all the DevOps best practices automatically when I create the resources too? In fact, some of these solutions are available today for a limited set of resources. If you actually either create a app service, or if you create a static web app, or I think those are the two. Definitely, there is a provision where while creating, it actually asks you, tell me, where should my code, code repo should live. Tell me how should I just provision some of the DevOps best practices. Now we are just at a really early version of it, but as we evolve, we just want to really make sure that the bridge between these two is seamless. Like it doesn't matter whether you started on Azure, whether you started on GitHub, you will get the best practice or industry practices where you can just make sure that your DevOps is fully automated, your repos are fully secured, the right permissions are set up, and at some point even the monitoring stuff is also 100% taken care, is what we'd love to achieve.
And this may be a bit of a loaded question, so you don't feel like you have to answer it. But for folks who are using Azure DevOps, and then there are the folks using GitHub, and there's a difference between the two, right? So I use both as part of my regular work. I feel I need to learn two different things, right? I mean, the whole thing with the way stories are handled in Azure DevOps is different from the way it's handled and as Cynthia said, the YAML definitions for the pipelines are of course not the same. So is there a plan to unify these approaches, at least so that developers' lives are easy and they don't have to learn two things? Like it seems like Microsoft is producing two things different for a developer. Is there something afoot, to kind of unify that approach?
Oh my God, Suji, you got to ask that question, right?
I'm sorry. As I said, if it's a loaded question, if you don't feel like you don't want to answer it, don't answer it.
Yeah. Let me just tell you, the way to think about this is I think, Azure DevOps, when it was built, it was focused a lot more towards enterprise, right? It has a significant enterprise focus, and then that's how it just got evolved. And now when we just look at it, the GitHub is a significant mind share from developers' perspective. And GitHub was focusing primarily on the developer key scenarios on how do I just create my pull request? How do I just, make, code writing better? How do I just make sure that my repo is organized in the best way? I think, nobody can beat them. I think, they have the best solution. Whereas Azure DevOps, obviously it had repos too, but given that it was targeting for enterprises, it had other solutions like, how do I just do pipelines is one, how do I do, boards is one, how do I do, testing is one, like, taking care of most of the enterprise requirements. Now with this acquisition, we do want to bring it together. Now here is the story, or here is my recommendation. I know maintaining two systems is a little bit harder, but obviously GitHub, we are trying to bring it up, right? With most of the features that that Azure DevOps has. As I just talked about, Actions is the one that's just coming up, but it is backed by pipelines. So similar story. So today, if you are as a customer on Azure DevOps, absolutely you can just continue to be there. Microsoft is fully supporting the entire Azure DevOps. There is nothing to panic. You can continue to use it. There are enhancements that are getting done. But if you are starting a brand new project, Suji, my recommendation is get started on GitHub. Because the innovations that we have done in GitHub with respect to the repo or PR experiences that I talked about, or even the security perspective, right? The advanced security perspective, I think security is becoming critical for every application, for every enterprise, for maintaining all the governance perspective too. It is being really, really critical. And there is absolutely no product in the world, including ADO, didn't have all of the security features that are there. Purely for that perspective, I think my recommendation is if you are starting a brand new project, get started on GitHub, start using repos. And then if you don't meet your requirements, for example, if you start on GitHub today, maybe, I think for planning, purely if you want to do planning, roadmap, how do I do better tracking of all my issues and work items? I don't think issues will meet enterprise need today. You can use Azure boards as just the only one. And the integration between these two is great. That will be my answer.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, so I do agree with you that the whole story management is a lot easier in Azure DevOps. And then you can just point Azure DevOps to GitHub for the repo section. Is that what you're referring to?
That's what I'm just saying. That's right.
Okay. And in that case, the pipelines.
Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to complete that. So with the pipelines, it's the same. Do you say we should use Azure DevOps pipelines, or you think like the GitHub Actions innovations are a lot more now?
I think today for most of the people, probably for CI, if you want to divide CI and CD separately, I think most of the CI requirements are met with GitHub Actions. Now, if you want to do CI and CD both, I think Azure Pipelines has a lot more feature set that you want to do. And again, Azure Pipelines has also deeper integration with GitHub repos. So you can actually store your code in GitHub, you get the security, and you leverage Azure both and Azure Pipelines for your planning and then the CI/CD solution.
That's really good. Thank you. Sorry, Cynthia, you were saying something.
Oh, no worries. So for our listeners, CI is continuous integration and CD is continuous deployment. And Gopi, you're alluding a lot to security. So can you tell us a little bit more about the DevSecOps story with GitHub and using it on Azure?
Oh, yeah. I think I can, we have done a bunch of announcements even in Ignite and before in Build too. If you want to look at in the market, the best DevSecOps end-to-end integration, I think GitHub and Azure is the story that you have to use. Like the way you start from how do I just make sure that my pull request, as part of my pull request, can I make sure my code is getting tested and I'm merging the code which already meets all the quality criteria. Now, in addition to that, you can actually include all the security. Like when I say security, if accidentally, if anyone includes their tokens, right? It can be Azure tokens or any of those tokens inside the GitHub code. It can just be caught as early as possible so that none of your code is getting leaked. It can be tokens, it can be passwords too. So that's a great story. That's a great story we want to get started. Not just stopping it there. I think GitHub as a Dependabot, where if you are using many of the packages, it can be OSS packages. As soon as you found a vulnerability in any of those packages, Dependabot can automatically raise pull request so that your code you are trying to remove all the vulnerabilities. And in addition to that, if you are using containers, right, and containers also can contain vulnerabilities, and using GitHub Actions, like Azure provides the security vulnerability container scans that need to be done. You can pre-scan all your images before you push them into the container registry. So as far as the developer is concerned, if he's writing his code at that moment, can we make sure that the code that is getting shared or getting merged into the master branch is completely, security free as much as possible. But afterwards, if there are events or if there are new vulnerabilities that do come in, I think GitHub has features where it can just create new pull request, and it will notify you saying that, hey, there is a security issue in this package, go consume the new package or fix this issue. So phenomenal story, phenomenal integration that exists between Azure Security Center and GitHub to achieve the DevSecOps scenarios.
For some of the things you just mentioned, are these actions or steps that the developer would have to set up? Or are these like built-in wizard type that I just have to click a button and like make my process secure, and then it'll scan for all of those vulnerabilities?
Yeah, it's a great question. Like all the password scanning, token scanning, some of the code QL scanning that I just talked about, some of the package scanning, I think it's just like a wizard button where you just need to configure it. You will just get all of those for free.
That's awesome.
So Azure plus GitHub, best story for DevSecOps.
I think you've convinced me for sure. Thank you, Gopi. That was really, really well put. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been great. And if you have any resources or anything like that, just hand them over to Cynthia, and she'll put them on the along with the show notes in this episode.
For sure. Any last comments you want to share with the listeners? Anything that they should go do and try out?
Oh no, I think first of all, I'm just glad to be here. Excited to be part of now Azure podcast too. So great. I think I will just tell only one thing to all the listeners to say, if you have not tried out GitHub, go try it out. And GitHub with Azure will make you best DevSecOps solution, and it just improves your productivity immensely.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.